Um, Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar this evening. My name's Nicole Gordon. I'm a Senior Associate with Pinner Sustainability, and I'll be facilitating the webinar this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and respect the Indigenous peoples within whose traditional lands we're meeting today. The webinar this evening will provide an overview of work that's underway to modernise the Regional District of Central Kootenay's approach to managing land use in hazardous areas. The project team who are joining us tonight will be sharing information on two related projects which are helping to achieve this. Firstly, the Floodplain Management Bylaw, which is a collaboration between RDCK and the Village of Salmo. And secondly, the Risk Tolerance Policy Project. Just to start, I'd like to introduce the team who'll be providing the introduction to these projects and answering your questions this evening. Starting with the team from the Regional District of Central Kootenay, we've got Stephanie Johnson, who's a planner and the co-lead on the Floodplain Management Bylaw project. Nora Hannon, Senior Advisor, and the project lead for the Risk Tolerance Policy. And Corey Scott, who's also a planner, who's the co-lead for the Floodplain Management Bylaw project. BGC Engineering are the consultants supporting RDCK with this work. And from their team, we have Alyssa Scordo, who's a principal hydrologist and the flood lead, and Chris Holm, who's a principal geoscientist and the risk lead on the project. And finally, myself, Nicole Gordon, I'm a senior associate with Pinner Sustainability, and we're supporting the engagement on these projects. Okay, before we get started, I'd like to provide a quick overview of what you can expect from this evening's webinar. If you could just move the slide up. Perfect, thank you. So to start, we'll have a couple of presentations. So firstly, Chris will be providing us some context around geohazards and land use planning. Then Alyssa will be providing an introduction to the Floodplain Management Bylaw project. Chris will give us an overview and introduction to the Risk Tolerance Policy project. And then we'll have a dedicated question and answer session where the team will respond to your questions. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentations using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. So if you actually sort of move your cursor down, you should see the chat function just left of center at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, it will bring up the chat and you can type your questions into the chat. You can submit them at any time during the presentation. I'll be monitoring it as they come in, and I'll bring these forward in that question and answer period. So we'll have the presentations first, and then any questions you have, we'll be bringing them up at that session towards the end. We might group similar questions together to help us get through them as we go, and I'll be sort of trying to keep track of that as we go. And then finally, we'll be finishing up this evening with some next steps before we leave you to enjoy the rest of your evening. With that, I'll hand over to Chris to get us started.
Thank you, Nicole, and appreciate those that took the time to come on this call today and listen as we share about some of the work that we've been involved with here, and hopefully we can answer your questions as well. The Regional District of Central Kootenay is subject to a range of what we refer to as geohazards. It's a fact of life for anyone that gets to live in these beautiful mountainous regions such as the Kootenays. Geohazards are a kind of hazard of many different types, but the word geo refers to natural processes that occur usually with some mixture of water, soil, and bedrock mixed together. And they're triggered by rainfall or snowmelt, and they usually occur in areas of steeper terrain. There is not a perfectly tidy way to bucket the various kinds of geohazards that occur, but it's very common to break them into three different categories. And these are the categories that we think about when we assess risk, as well as when we think about for decision making. We talk about floods, which are the main valley stems where mostly it's water that might inundate an area. Steep creeks, which are the mountainous tributaries that come off of the hill slopes and typically carry a much higher proportion of rock, debris, and they can be more destructive as a result. And then there's landslides that we think about on open slopes that have less rock, more dirt or bedrock, and there's lots of different kinds from rockfall to debris avalanches. And the Johnson's Landing landslide that many on this call may be familiar with is one example of a landslide. Next slide. Now, hazards are just half of risk. The other half, of course, is what we value that could be at stake. Anything that we value, people, built environment, areas of high cultural value, natural environment, any of these values may face damage or loss from geohazards. And as a result, it becomes very important to understand both where those geohazards are, what they're like, how they might change over time, for example, with climate change, and what they affect, which is our elements that we live in and work around in the places in which we live. Next slide there, Nicole. Now, one way to think about the decision making that we do in these areas and that the local authorities are involved with is in three parts. The first part is to understand the hazard itself and the risk. The second is to put in place a solid, transparent, and objective decision-making process to make decisions about that risk. And the third would be the actions that might result from that decision-making process. So in the middle there's a land use planning process. So it's the means of decision-making typically enforceable in law that might, for example, manage the development of lands in these hazardous areas. And that's the main topic for today. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to, is it Alyssa, I think? That's going to help
That's
us
right.
talk through. Oh, perfect. Thanks, Alyssa. Alyssa's going to talk through the floodplain management bylaw portion of our work that we've been involved with here. Alyssa?
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Chris, I think, and giving the context for this work. I'm happy to give an introduction to work that we have underway with RDCK and Village of Salmo to support an update to both existing floodplain management bylaws. As mentioned, the intent of this project is to review land use policies related to flood and steep creeks across the regional district and provide recommendations for policy updates. So in terms of the types of hazards that we are considering that Chris has introduced, we're looking at what are potential ways that we can manage risk associated with floods and steep creek hazards. The floodplain management bylaw is the key regulatory tool used by both RDCK and Village of Salmo to manage floods and steep creek hazards. Both jurisdictions use hazard mapping, flood construction levels, and floodplain setbacks to guide safe development, and those are included in the bylaws. These tools help to establish minimum building elevations, required setbacks from major watercourses, and ensure developments avoid high-risk areas. In particular, RDCK's floodplain management bylaw is the primary mechanism for regulating development in hazard-prone areas and applies to all of the rural electoral areas, including areas without zoning. Last year, the province released a BC flood strategy document that emphasized taking an integrated approach to flood management that includes a focus on land use-based tools and approaches to flood management. RDCK and Salmo's floodplain management bylaws, along with associated hazard maps, is one of those tools that we can use to help to manage potential impacts from hazards. The bylaw itself can inform a range of land use decisions from high-level hazard policy, land use designations, official community plans, and as well as citing flood construction levels, setbacks, and zoning regulations to inform building permits and subdivision applications and approvals. So a range of applications that can be used across the regional district. The project will help support an update to the development of updated floodplain bylaws for both RDCK and Salmo. RDCK's floodplain management bylaw was adopted in 2009 and last amended in 2019, while the Village of Salmo's bylaw was adopted in 1994 and amended in 2008. As a result, this project is intended to help modernize RDCK's community and land use policies related to geohazards, which have not been evaluated against recent hazard mapping and risk assessments completed since 2019. The project aims to modernize the bylaws by integrating current terminology related to geohazards, recent hazard mapping, and best practices related for flood hazard management. The intent of the policy updates is to help guide decision-making that reduces community exposure and vulnerability to flood, bank erosion, and steep creek hazards. And as mentioned, the policy update would apply to all of the electoral areas in RDCK. The project includes several key tasks. Our team recently completed a detailed review of municipal bylaws across the district, as well as broader geographical review of relevant hazard and risk policies and best practices. We're also undertaking stakeholder engagement with First Nations, RDCK staff, and qualified professionals in order to get a good sense of how the current bylaw is working and how we could potentially help to modernize and streamline the process. Key deliverables for this project include a regulatory map that will compile all of the flood and steep creek hazard mapping as a spatial data layer and draft bylaw language and recommendations for RDCK and Salmo to support an update to the existing floodplain management bylaw. The project is scheduled to be completed this June. We expect to deliver draft policy language and regulatory mapping for early spring this year. I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to share an introduction to this project and really look forward to hearing any questions as part of our Q&A session at the end of the meeting. I'll now turn it over to Chris to give an introduction to the second project that we are currently underway with RDCK, and that's the development of risk tolerance policy.
There, now I'm unmuted. Thanks, Alyssa. We've talked about hazards and risk, and we've talked about the decision-making processes that might be put in place. But there's a third piece to this that's very important, and it's less of a scientific question and as much a social question. And it's something that, whether we think about it explicitly or not, we really make decisions about in everyday life. And that's that all of life has risks, and each day we need to think about the types of risks that we're prepared to tolerate, whether that's crossing the street or driving a vehicle or developing a home in a hazard area. And so in this particular case, there's the community charter and other bylaws in this particular example, the floodplain management bylaw, that might require areas to be so-called safe for the intended use. The key question here, though, is what does safe mean? Planners, those local authorities, may need to make decisions about safe. It's very helpful in cases where that decision is needing to be made for those making those decisions to have clear criteria about what safe means. The same is true for qualified professionals that might be retained to make a determination of safe for the use in the intended use. With clear, transparent criteria about what safe means, it means that there can be more consistency of decision-making across the entirety of the district. And the purpose of this project is to explore that. The RDCK is certainly not the first jurisdiction to explore this topic. And so it's to, through BGC's experience, we've been involved in quite a number of various projects around risk tolerance policy, consider what the RDCK might consider to be safe for the intended use. Next slide there, Alyssa. So as I mentioned, risk tolerance criteria provide a consistent basis for evaluating whether development applications meet safe for the intended use expectations. And there's the example that's been shown here is in Canmore. This is quite a good example because it's comparable. Canmore has lots of alluvial fans, for example, in the bottom of their valley. They were heavily affected by flooding in June of 2013. Those on the call might recall the Calgary floods at the time. And through that process, Canmore embarked on a process much like what we are doing here to come up with an update to their land use bylaw, as well as to put in place risk tolerance criteria, both for individuals as well as groups or societal risk that might be faced by those communities that are in hazardous lands. Next slide there, Alyssa. So in this case, the objective is to develop a safe for the use intended policy. It stands apart from the floodplain management bylaw. In other words, it's not part directly of the bylaw. It's referenced in the bylaw as might be applicable. It's applicable in certain cases and not so much in others. That in turn then can help guide risk-informed planning decisions that, when done over time, can help enhance community resilience against natural hazards in the RDCK, and also put in place these, as I mentioned, clear criteria so that those that are affected by permitting decisions understand the reasons why a risk might be considered intolerable or not tolerable, and where actions might be needed. So the key project tasks that are involved, as I mentioned, is first to take a look outside the RDCK. There's many jurisdictions that have thought through this, not just for geohazards. This is a subject that dates back many years, including for various types of non-natural hazards. So to take a look at the best practices, Canmore, as I mentioned, North Vancouver, District of Squamish, others that have faced this question in the past. To take a look at existing RDCK policies and processes as they relate to risk tolerance. What are the implications of adopting certain criteria here? To engage with stakeholders and interested parties and others, and decision makers, government, First Nations, qualified professionals, practitioners, those that might be tasked with implementing this type of policy. And then from that, develop recommendations around risk tolerance criteria and policy language, and report that out to the RDCK. At the end of the day, it's not the qualified professionals, BGC, that decides RDCK's risk tolerance. It's RDCK itself. But what we can do in this process is present materials that have worked well elsewhere, and in doing so, inform RDCK's decision-making around this topic. So for this particular project, it all similarly started in October of 2025, and similarly, it's scheduled to be complete for May 2026. So it follows a similar process to what Alyssa had mentioned for the floodplain management bylaw. And I will say it's quite helpful to do these two pieces in parallel because they really need to play well together. If you're talking about the risk tolerance policy, it needs to match up nicely with the types of language that you put into a floodplain bylaw so that certain actions in the floodplain bylaw can trigger a need to determine, for example, whether an area is safe for the use intended. And then with that in place, to have risk tolerance criteria that can be used to make that decision. Is this me, Alyssa? I can keep talking. I can't remember. Okay, thank you. All right, so as I mentioned, the floodplain management bylaw and the risk tolerance policy come together, and they aim to improve land use planning decisions in hazardous areas through a few different pieces to this puzzle. Updated mapping, which indicates areas that are potential hazard and where action might need to be taken to first better understand those hazards, associated risk, and then perhaps to take actions if those risks prove to be intolerable, or in other cases to take prescriptive actions, such as to build to a certain flood construction level. To modernize the policy so that it's well aligned with those best practices in the modernized maps, and then to put in place very clear expectations for the application process that would need to be acted upon through these floodplain management bylaws and other bylaws that might come in place later. There's the implementation too. So to put in place a defined set of criteria so that a proponent that needs to navigate this process can set clear expectations and understand what might be needed by a qualified professional retained to do parts of this work, such as to determine whether a site is safe for the use intended. And also to think about this both today and under future conditions. And this is part of the hazard process, and it's something that's already in some ways considered in the mapping for floodplains, at least throughout the district. And this package, or this toolbox together then, is what's needed and what the RDCK is putting in place to better enhance community resiliency across the district. All right, so a couple key pieces here then that we've gone through. First, one of the trade-offs of getting to live in such a beautiful region, the RDCK is prone to geohazards. We all know that, and many on this call have lived that experience within the district. Current bylaws exist. They're in place. They've been in place for a long time, but currently they refer to older information and they do need some updates. The mapping has been done. That's been put in place thanks to resources that the RDCK has managed to deploy over the last almost 10 years now. And the current step is to update the decision-making process, the policies to reflect that. And in turn, and lastly, the RDCK, and in association with the village of Selmo, are completing the work to improve the regulations so that the current knowledge about hazards matches up with the bylaws, and then together it can inform decision-making throughout the district. And with that, we've reached the end of the summary presentation.